Welcome, everyone. So, I just wanted to start out with a short little recap of the last several videos that I've done, as this video is going to connect and be a continuation as I move into some other topics related to this overall theme that I've kind of been looking at as far as the history of America and the mounds and their connection with the occult and the esoteric, and with different religious movements and spiritual movements, and how that tracks back through history, all the way back to quote unquote ancient Egypt and into Atlantis. Um, I did a video on Mount Shasta and the mountain's connection to New Age spirituality, occult groups, and strange phenomena. The late 1800s channeling of Philos the Atlantean, which was in a book about Atlantis. The connection between the mountain and the Great White Brotherhood, Theosophy, Anthroposophy, all happening during the time of a series of great awakenings in America. And I didn't mention this. I just recently seen another channel did a pretty good video on the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, that were written by Doriel, and Doriel's connection with Mount Shasta and Atlantis, which is pretty interesting. Claiming that Doriel is basically a fraud, purporting to have channeled these emerald tablets as opposed to the emerald tablet, which is a completely different thing. In the Mounds and Mormons videos, we looked at some different Indian mounds and their connection to other elements of ancient America. This idea that all of these other things were here, the star forts, some of these buildings may or may not have been built when they were purported to have been built. I don't know. The connection of Mormonism to ancient America. I mean, the entire Book of Mormon itself also purporting that America has this sort of ancient connection running through ancient history, through the Bible. Joseph Smith's connection to esoteric and occult groups and teachings, which we're going to talk about some today. The story of the golden plates, Smith's mummies, and the Egyptian connection. And there's still more to explore on that, because that's all part of this bigger narrative that Smith is a part of and finds himself really in the middle of, as many other people that we're going to look at in future videos. The Manuscripts and Murder video, I had been using this book, The Widow's Son by Carrie Ross Boren, and really that video just looked at his connections to a known forger, Mark Hoffman, and some other murders that were going on in Salt Lake City from 1982 through about 1987. There was a lot of things that were going on that were affecting the Mormon church. And I think some of those things, are just always things that were going to happen, that were going to come out. Whether Mark Hoffman, was trying to embarrass the church, did the forgeries themselves contain actual truth? We don't know. So that's kind of where I've been going with this, using Joseph Smith, Mormonism, and the Mounds as an entry point into a much broader story that's unfolding. And somebody had reached out to me, a friend of mine that I hadn't talked to in quite a while. And we had a really great conversation. We actually had several conversations, but one of the things that was brought up during this conversation was this term, winning the faculty of Abrac. And what exactly that is was something I wanted to look into, and didn't really know how it was going to relate to the research I was already doing, but it ultimately did. So the first time we really hear about this term, winning the faculty of Abrac, is in something called the Leland manuscript. So I'm going to read a little bit from Albert Mackey's description of the Leland manuscript. The Leland manuscript, so called because it is said to have been discovered by the celebrated antiquary John Leland, and sometimes called the Locke manuscript, in consequence of the supposititious annotations appended to it by that metaphysician, has for more than a century attracted the attention and more recently excited the controversies of Masonic scholars. After having been cited with approbation by such writers as Preston, Hutchinson, Oliver, and Krauss, it has suffered a reverse under the crucial examination of later critics. It has by nearly all of these been decided to be a forgery, a decision from which very few at this day would dissent. Another forgery. Here we go. It is, in fact, one of those pious frauds intended to strengthen the claim of the order to a great antiquity and to connect it with the mystical schools of the ancients. And if you think about it, some of the documents that Mark Hoffman was forging were documents thought to at least have existed at some point that did have these ties, not only to America's ancient past, but to the mystical side of the religion itself. But as it proposes a theory concerning the origin of the institution, which was long accepted as a legend of the order, it is entitled to a place in the legendary history of Freemasonry. The story of this manuscript and the way in which it was introduced to the notice of the craft is a singular one. So he's already saying that this document, this manuscript, not only is it a fraud, but it's a pious one, because it just wanted to strengthen an already accepted claim to great antiquity that people in the order already accepted prior to this manuscript being found. In the Gentleman's Magazine for September 1753, the so-called manuscript was printed for the first time under the title of Certain Questions with Answers to the Same Concerning the Mystery of Masonry, written by the hand of King Henry VI of the name, and faithfully copied by me, John Leland, antiquarian, by the command of His Highness. So Leland was employed to search for antiquities in the libraries of cathedrals, abbeys, priories, colleges, and all places where any ancient records were to be found. The article in the Gentleman's Magazine is prefaced with these words: "The following treatise is said to be printed at Frankfurt, Germany, 1748, under the title, A Letter of the famous Mr. John Locke relating to Freemasonry, found in the desk of scriptor of a deceased brother." It is introduced by a letter from Mr. Locke, the celebrated author of the Essay on the Human Understanding. It's said to be sent to the Earl of Pembroke under date of May 6th, 1696, in which he states that by the help of Mr. CNS, and apparently the name is not known, he had obtained a copy of the manuscript in the Bodleian Library, which he therewith had sent to the Earl. Is it accompanied by numerous notes which were made the day before Mr. Locke for the reading of Lady Masham, who had become very fond of Masonry. Mr. Locke says, the manuscript of which this is a copy appears to be about 160 years old. Yet, as your lordship will observe, by the title, it is itself a copy of one yet more ancient by about 100 years. For the original is said to have been the handwriting of King Henry VI. Where the prince had it is at present an uncertainty, but it seems to me to be an examination, taken perhaps before the king, of someone of the Brotherhood of Masons, among whom he entered himself, as 'tis said, when he came out of his minority, and thenceforth put a stop to the persecution that had been raised against them. The examination, for such it purports to be, Mr. Locke supposes, consists of 12 questions and answers. The style and orthography is an attempted imitation of the language of the 15th century. How far successful the attempt has been will be discussed hereafter. Masonry is described to be the skill of nature, the understanding of the might that is therein and its various operations, besides the skill of numbers, weights, and measures, and the true manner of fashioning all things for the use of man, principally dwellings and buildings of all kinds and all other things that may be useful to man. Its origin is said to have been with the first men of the East, who were before the man of the West, by which Mr. Locke, in his note, says is meant pre-Adamites, the man of the West being Adam. The Phoenicians, who first came from the East into Phoenicia, are said to have brought it westwardly by the way of the Red and Mediterranean seas. So now they're connecting this document, this knowledge to the Phoenicians. It was brought into England by Pythagoras, who is called in the document Peter Gower, evidently from the French spelling of the name Petagore. He, having traveled in search of knowledge into Egypt, Syria, and every other land where the Phoenicians had planted masonry, having obtained a knowledge of the art in the lodges of masons into which he gained admission, on his return to Europe he settled in Magna Graecia, the name given by the ancients to southern Italy, and established a grand lodge at Crotona, one of its principal cities, where he made many masons. Some of there traveled into France and made many masons, whence in process of time the art passed over into England. Such is the history of the origin and progress of masonry which is given in the Leland manuscript. The remainder of the document is engaged in giving the character and the objects of the institution. Thus, it is said in relation to secrecy that Masons have at all times communicated to mankind such of their secrets as would generally be useful, and have kept back only those that might be harmful in evil hands, those that could be of no use unless accompanied by the teachings of the lodge, and those which are employed to bind the brethren more strongly together. The arts taught by Masons to mankind are enumerated as being agriculture, architecture, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, music, poetry, chemistry, government, and religion. I guess not alchemy, though. Masons are said to be better teachers than other men, because the first of them received from God the art of finding new arts and of teaching them, whereas the discoveries of other men have been but few and acquired only by chance. This art of discovery the Masons conceal for their own profit. They also conceal the art of working miracles, the art of foretelling future events, the art of changes, which Mr. Locke has made in a note to interpret as signifying the transmutation of metals. Okay, so alchemy. The method of acquiring the faculty of Abrac, the power of becoming good and perfect without the aid of fear and hope, and the universal language. And lastly, it is admitted that Masons do not know more than other men, but only have a better opportunity of knowing, in which many fail for want of capacity and industry. And as to their virtue, while it is acknowledged that some are not so good as other men, yet it is believed that for the most part they are better than they would be if they were not Masons. And it is claimed that Masons greatly love each other, because good and true men, knowing each other to be such, always love the more, the better they are. And here endeth the questions and answers. There does not appear to be any great novelty or value in this document. The theory of the origin of Masonry had been advanced by others before its appearance in public, and the characteristics of Masonry had been previously defined in better language. But no sooner is it printed in the Gentleman's Magazine for the month of September in the year 1753 than it is seized as a bonne bouche by printers and writers, so that being first received with surprise, it was soon accepted as a genuine relic of the early age of English Masonry and incorporated into its history, a position that it has not yet lost in the opinion of some. So this is from Albert Mackey. He is a Freemason writing on the validity of this document. And he's saying it's a fraud, but it's a pious one. And in a way, it's already just trying to make a connection, a fraudulent document, a piece of evidence to connect Masonry to the ancient past, to the ancient knowledge, the arts of discovering new arts and keeping that secret. How do we know what we know? How do we acquire knowledge of technology? How to create new things? This is what they're hinting at here. So this is already accepted by Masons, according to Mackey. So it doesn't even matter that this document's a fraud, because everything it's saying is generally accepted as true by them as part of their legend or their myth. What do the Masons conceal? This is one of the questions from the Leland manuscript. They concealeth the art of finding new arts. They concealeth the art of keeping secrets, the art of wonder working, and of foreseeing things to come, the art of changes, the way of winning the faculty of Abrac. So this is a Hutchinson that he mentions, quotes this. And I just wanted to show it in the Old English. It's actually pretty fun trying to read this. It kind of, when you just look at it and you kind of know what it's saying, it really, you don't really get too tripped up by it. Interesting. So during the time that Joseph Smith is operating, there's a lot of anti-Masonic sentiment going on in America. And this is kind of this is just representative of these anti-Masonic feelings and sentiments. They, the Masons, had the way of winning the faculty of Abrac, by which I can define nothing but witchcraft or devil dealing. For we are told that the Masons were masters of the then so much dreaded occult arts, or what was called the black art. Besides, such a document was enough to call down the thunders of the church upon these supposed sorcerers, and we find that they were persecuted by the Bishop of Winchester, which is a matter of course, if such notions were entertained of Masons, or such professions made by them as this document imports. So he's referencing this Leland document, but this is an anti-Masonic scholar writing about Masonry in the early 1800s. So in my search for the faculty of Abrac and its meaning, its usage, its history, I was confronted with something that Lucy Mack Smith actually said. And I found this: reconsidering Lucy Mack Smith's folk magic confession, Samuel Brown. In her justly famous family memoir, Lucy Mack Smith, mother of Mormon founder Joseph Smith Jr., invested considerable energy in establishing and maintaining the honor of Mormonism's first family. Her biographical sketches of the prophet Joseph Smith and his progenitors for many generations tells in great depth the story of early Mormonism's most famous family in a sustained apology for the Smiths and the visionary church founded by Joseph Jr. Dictated in 1845 to Martha Knowlton Corey in Nauvoo, Lucy's memoir in part supported the family's claim vis-a-vis Smith's apostolic successor Brigham Young, while dealing with the reality of revelations about Smith's controversies in life, especially but not exclusively polygamy, and the aftermath of his death. In the original manuscript, though not in the published versions, Lucy Mack attempted to define the family's honor in a statement that has been much discussed but rarely understood. And so this is the statement that she made. Let not the reader suppose we stopped our labor and went at trying to win the faculty of Abrac, drawing magic circles or soothsaying to the neglect of all kinds of business. And I read some commentary on this. There's people that believe she's denying that they actually went about trying to win the faculty of Abrac or doing any of that stuff. There were those, and I happen to agree with the latter, that say she certainly had the knowledge of this because they were doing this stuff. And we'll kind of see the evidence for that as we go. But it seems like Joseph Smith's mother knew of this phrase that only appears for the first time in the 1700s in a manuscript that most agree is a complete forgery. So the faculty of Abrac had to have been a phrase that was in usage by Masons and other secret societies that just hadn't ever been written down for public consumption. So Claire Barris wrote a really great paper. I think it was a scholarly paper for possibly a dissertation. But this is what she has to say. The mid-18th century forged Leland manuscript successfully implanted the concept of secretive magical practices into Masonic ideology. Included was the Masonic unique phrase, winning the faculty of Abrac, also quoted by Lucy Mack Smith. Henry Dana Ward's 1828 anti-Masonic treatment reflects how the Leland manuscript concepts had been expanded to include the American magic culture of the 1820s, a quasi-Masonic magic blend into which the Smiths fit. Magic circles are not mentioned in Masonic sources, but they are by Ward's 1820s overlay of esoteric folk culture onto the Leland forgery influencing Masonry. Lucy Smith may be reflecting the common vernacular of the treasure-seeking folk magic realm from which Ward was also drawing, and she could also be referring to specific family magic practices and perceptions, with Joseph Smith as a soothsayer, seer turning prophet, using conjuring instructions from the Magus that invoke Abrac when attempting to control spirits within a magic circle. Ward includes each of the forms of magic listed by Lucy Mack Smith. Additionally, he includes conjuring and magic words that are also tied to folk magic and part of the Smiths' magic relics, the layman's ceremonial dagger and talisman. Ward equates Abrac with magic. And this is coming from the book Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview by D. Michael Quinn, which is from 1987. So here at the tail end of all of that stuff going on with the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City, a lot of these connections really start to come out more, I think, in writing, especially histories and scholarly works that I've found by Mormons and non-Mormons. So this is what D. Michael Quinn has to say as well. Mormon historian Richard L. Bushman observed that thereby Lucy revealed a knowledge of magic formulas and rituals. One Palmyra resident reported that the prophet's mother also performed various forms of magic divination, including palmistry. Without dissent, the LDS Church's official newspaper reprinted this statement. Marvin S. Hill has concluded, in her mind, magic circles, soothsaying, and other magical arts were one with her religious activities. Since antiquity, drawing magic circles has been central to the ritual magic of incantation, necromancy, and treasure hunting. This could be done with chalk, yet most magic handbooks required a specially consecrated sword or dagger for the ceremony. Palmyra neighbors stated that Joseph Sr. and Jr. drew circles for treasure hunting. The neighbors did not mention if the Smiths used a tool to draw these circles of ceremonial magic. Likewise, without mentioning an instrument, Milo Bell of Broome County, New York, commented on young Joseph's treasure quest near the Susquehanna River. Apparently hired as a treasure digger, Bell said that they would make a circle, and Joe Smith claimed if they threw any dirt over the circle, the money chest would leave. In 1830, Palmyra's newspaper claimed that young Joseph's occult mentor also drew a magic circle with a rusty sword. Despite that report's sarcasm, there is verified evidence of a dagger rather than a sword. Confirming these stories, the Hiram Smith family has preserved as an heirloom the kind of dagger necessary for ritual magic. The first public announcement of its existence was an authorized inventory of Hiram Smith's relics. This biography described the artifact as dagger, Masonic, 10-inch, stainless steel, wooden handle, Masonic symbols on blade. Photographs of the Smith dagger have been in print since 1982, and slides were screened at a public convention in Salt Lake City during 1985. And here we see the blade that they're talking about, which I was reading in another article about this particular dagger, that it has the sigil from Mars on it. And it had to do with Joseph Smith's birth chart and some other astrological things that lined up with Smith. Here is the Holiness to the Lord parchment. This is what was used in the invocation or the summoning. You have the seer stones. Here's another view of the blade itself and one of these boards that they used in the process. So Quinn continues, and I just pulled out some sections. This book I would recommend if people are interested in this topic. I think it's a really good book so far. I've been getting into it. It's definitely focused on Mormonism and its connections to magic, but it really goes a lot into magic itself. And, you know, it's not just about Joseph Smith and Mormonism. One should also consider 4 additional characteristics of the magic worldview. First, peculiar to the magical or mythical perception of reality is that it does not distinguish, as we do, between lifeless and living things, between organic and inorganic. All have power and life of one kind or another in them. This can also be expressed by saying that all things have a soul. This is sometimes called an animistic worldview. Second, there are no symbols as such in the occult magic worldview. Special words, signs, numbers, and inanimate objects are in themselves powerful, even if they also represent something else. Third, for the dweller in the magical world, no event is accidental or random, but each has its chain of causation in which power or its lack was the decisive agency. In other words, things do not happen by coincidence. Finally, and perhaps most important, the magic worldview can be both emotionally satisfying and rational for those sharing such perceptions. The perceived rationality of magic has not been restricted to pre-modern or pre-industrial societies, but it has certainly been more pervasive and less self-conscious among such peoples. With a degree of empathy once unusual among academics, Morris Berman has stated why magic was as appealing to its adherents as science has been for us. It is not merely the case that men conceived of matter as possessing mind in those days, but rather that in those days matter did possess mind, actually did so. When the obvious objection is raised that the mechanical worldview must be true, because we are in fact able to send a man to the moon or invent technologies that demonstrably work, I can only reply that the animistic worldview, which lasted for millennia, was also fully efficacious to its believers. In other words, our ancestors constructed reality in a way that typically produced verifiable results. The potentially religious dimension of these definitions raises the problem of clearly differentiating magic from religion. Influential writers attempted such distinctions from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, and these views continue to be reflected in textbooks and scholarly writings. For modern Americans, the distinction between magic and religion seems simple and obvious enough. Magic being by definition false or wicked, or both, couldn't possibly be confused with religion, which was equally by definition true and virtuous. Yet while such views have dominated, there have been dissenting voices. Ernst Cassirer, a philosopher of culture, summed up both the motivation for and difficulty of separating magic and religion. It is natural to desire a clear-cut definition that would enable us to trace a sharp line of demarcation between magic and religion. Theoretically speaking, we are convinced that they cannot mean the same thing, and we are loath to trace them to a common origin. We think of religion as the symbolic expression of our highest moral ideals. We think of magic as a crude aggregate of superstitions. Religious beliefs seem to become mere superstitious credulity if we admit any relationship with magic. On the other hand, the character of our anthropological and ethnographical material makes it extremely difficult to separate the two fields. One traditional distinction is that religion is supplicative and magic coercive in intent. Or as anthropologist Lucy Mayer writes, the difference between religion and magic might be epitomized as the difference between communicating with beings and manipulating forces. However, even after affirming that distinction, one historian of early Christianity conceded that not one man in 1,000 fully lives up to this theoretical idea of religion, and that there are in ritual and liturgy elements which scarcely differ from magical arts and incantations. For example, it is difficult to ignore the coercive dimension of Acts 16:18. But Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the Spirit, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. In addition to the coercive dimension in religion, Keith Thomas, a British historian, notes the supplicative aspects of magic. Yet for the magicians themselves, the summoning of celestial beings was a religious rite in which prayer played an essential part, and where piety and purity of life were deemed essential. For many, this was no mechanical manipulation of set formula, but a humble supplication that God should extend to them the privilege of a unique view of his mysteries. At this level, the practice of magic became a holy quest, the search for knowledge, not by study and research, but by revelation. Baroya, in his study of witchcraft and witchcraft persecutions, magic and religion cannot, I repeat, be separated as simply as people used to think. The only real distinction that can be made is between white and black magic. Following Baroja's recommendation, it is easier to distinguish among kinds of magic than between magic and religion. Renaissance writer Gabriel Naud identified 4 separate categories of magic that produced 1, by the particular grace of the Almighty God, or 2, by the assistance of an angel, or 3, by that of a demon, or lastly, by his own industry and ability. From these 4 different ways, we infer 4 kinds of magic: divine relating to the first, theurgic to the second, goetic to the third, and natural to the last. Although the Age of Reason reduced the types of magic to divine, diabolic, and natural, the original distinctions hold up remarkably well after hundreds of years. Like sociologist Daniel Lawrence O'Keefe, I have come to regard magic and religion neither as identical entities nor as polar opposites, nor are they dual foci that overlap only peripherally. The position each occupies on the spectrum of beliefs and practices depends, of course, upon one's vantage point. But there is such a pronounced interrelationship among the various manifestations of magic and religion that the inextricable blending of the two at some point or points is difficult to overlook. Scholars have noted that this was true both of Joseph Smith's America and of Mormonism's early history. And so he goes on to talk about how he's actually doing this research. And I thought these were some pertinent bits that I also relate to the way I do things or what it is I'm actually doing sometimes. So I wanted to read this as well because I think it's interesting and it correlates very nicely. The most difficult challenge in using parallel evidence is the situation in which parallels exist without any known connection between individuals and the relevant evidence. Some have argued that without a demonstrable link, the analogies are insignificant, to which one scholar objected, "Are we to refuse to recognize them as parallels?" In such cases, one can argue that it is important to acknowledge close parallels as significant because what is done by one group of human beings may have been done for the same or similar reasons by another group without supposing any other hand between them than their common humanity. Likewise, I believe it is necessary to consider parallels because their existence is a form of evidence which should at least be acknowledged. Psychologist Carl Jung proposed one means to interpret parallels that lack causative links. He wrote that the connection of events may, in certain circumstances, be other than causal and requires another principle of explanation, which he defined as the archetype, a pattern of thought and its resulting act within the collective unconscious. Archetypal parallels do not require environmental, literary, historical, or causal connection. Rather, seemingly unconnected developments of thought and action may appear strikingly similar, leading to the almost metaphysical conclusion that they are replicating patterns or archetypes. I mean, just by looking at the things that come into my mind, the things I think about to research, even trying to cut myself off from outside influences to a certain degree. And inevitably, when I begin down a path of research, I always notice that somebody else has already tread that road before and said similar things, sometimes almost taking the words out of my mouth, what I wanted to say, and framing it in the same way that I wanted to frame it, telling the same narrative and the same story. And this happens time and time and time again. So to me, I really understand what Jung is getting at here by these archetypal parallels. Intriguing and possibly significant in themselves, such parallels do not necessarily represent a natural dependence between events or conscious borrowings of thought. My analysis uses parallel evidence from both the written text and oral tradition. In the occult tradition, the relationship between the printed word and folklore is especially interdependent. As Catherine Briggs describes, many of the occult writings never came into general circulation, but were handed down jealously from magician to magician. From the 15th century onward, however, there were many manuscript books of magic for the less learned through which scraps of occult knowledge were distributed among the people and returned again to the folklore from which they had been borrowed. For occult learning was originally founded upon folklore. It borrowed from magic and lent to it, and used symbols rooted in folk consciousness. In an even older process, magicians, academics, priests, and monks formalized occult folklore into manuscripts and books of occult philosophy and formula magic. In turn, this academic occult tradition filtered down to the common people, who incorporated it into their own folklore and folk religion, influencing, as a result, later academics, observers, writers, and practitioners of the occult. I mean, yeah, you can see that this continuation of these ideas through different cultures and their representations, although different at their core teachings, are almost the same with varying levels of difference. So I also found concerning the faculty of Abrac from the Freemasons magazine, somebody sent in an explanation of the faculty of Abrac to the editor. Sir, I was extremely delighted with a copy of that ancient and venerable manuscript concerning Freemasonry, with which you obliged the public. Speaking of the Leland manuscript. Mr. Locke's notes and exemplary remarks do the paper great honor, and his declaration and the ladies have contributed to increase the number of Masons in several lodges. There are, however, some passages so obscure that Mr. Locke himself knows not what to make of them. The way of winning the faculty of Abrac is one which I shall endeavor to elucidate. I apprehend that by the faculty of Abrac is meant the chimerical virtues ascribed to the magical term abracadabra, written or repeated in a particular manner. This fanciful charm is supposed to have been invented by the elder Simonius, I can't even pronounce that, in the time of the emperors Severus and Caracalla, and was thought to be efficacious in curing ages and preventing other diseases. The way of writing it was thus. And so you see this is the famous abracadabra magic triangle. A paper so inscribed was tied about the neck of the patient. It is the more probable that this may be the true explanation of the faculty of Abrac, because we see that several of the mysteries of Masonry enumerated in this old piece are obscurely, imperfectly, or corruptly expressed. For instance, Peter Gower. Who would imagine that Peter Gower was Pythagoras in disguise? Yet how naturally and satisfactorily is the corruption accounted for by the medium which Mr. Locke has so happily discovered. Pythagoras seems to have been fated to transmigrations. The transmigration of Euboris into Pythagoras seems scarce more incredible than at first sight the transmigration of Pythagoras into Peter Gower. Another explanation of the above is to be seen in Mr. Hutchinson's Spirit of Masonry, and we already looked at that quote. But this guy is saying that the faculty of Abrac is really just a way of, warding off disease. And I found this on Twitter. This was an excerpt from Defoe's Journal of the Plague. But there was still another madness beyond all this, which may serve to give an idea of the distracted humor of the poor people at that time. And this was their following a worse sort of deceivers than any of these. For these petty thieves only deluded them to pick their pockets and get their money, in which their wickedness, whatever it was, lay chiefly on the side of the deceivers deceiving, not upon the deceived. But in this part, I am going to mention it lay chiefly in the people deceived, or equally in both. And this was in wearing charms, philters, exorcisms, amulets, and I know not what preparations to fortify the body with them against the plague, as if the plague was not the hand of God, but a kind of a possession of an evil spirit, and that it was to be kept off with crossings, signs of the zodiac, papers tied up with so many knots and certain words or figures written on them, as particularly the word abracadabra formed in triangle or pyramid thus. Others had the Jesuits' mark in a cross, and others nothing but this mark thus. So it was fairly common, I guess, in folk magic to use abracadabra as a warding talisman to ward off disease. at least on some level, or for healing of other things. That could certainly be an aspect of it, but it also seems to be that it's part of a grimoire, and it's really more concerned with receiving the art of finding new arts, right? Figuring things out from the divine, giving you new technology, ways of interacting with nature to create new technology, new minerals, metallurgy, all kinds of things that are just, they're not just happy. I mean, how does man even discover any of this stuff? The stories are ridiculous. He's out stumbling around, and one day somebody just, picked a leaf off a plant and decided, you know what I'm going to do though? I'm going to take this leaf and I'm going to put it through a complicated chemical process. And at the end of that, I will get a pure white powder that will make me feel really, really good for about 20 minutes and make me want to go to the bathroom. That's not how these things happen. A lot of this thing, I mean, how do we know what DNA looks like? When you dig down deep enough into any of these stories, there's always a supernatural, religious / spiritual, esoteric component to them. There's a book out, there's several books. We're going to look at two of them. The Secret Masonic Process of Winning the Faculty of Abrac by Emma Valentia Straighton. So she had written another book, The Celestial Ship of the North, published in 1927. I found a little bit about her, but not really a whole lot. This was fairly interesting, though. She was writing 1858 to 1948, so she was 90. She was the daughter of the New York tobacco mogul John Straighton of Straighton and Storm, and likely inherited land in the Avern neighborhood in Long Island, which Straighton developed. So she was also involved with Francis Theodore Parsons, the author of Making the Body Think, and she was quoted in the horoscope section of various papers in 1927 after the publication of that Celestial Ship book. So this book here, one commenter or reviewer said that it's outright fraud. This is a chapter out of her other book, The Fraternity of the Builders. Exactly. I thought the author was going to explain what she did not explain in the larger book. I would never recommend this book. So apparently they're just pulling it out of a larger work, and nothing is actually explained about winning the faculty of Abrac, according to this reviewer, although I don't think I'm going to try to find the book and read it. This is another book that is more recent, 2021, The Faculty of Abrac, The Tradition, Training, and Techniques of Commanding Spirits. So here, this author, at least, is connecting it with Solomonic magic for the invocation of spirits, celestial, terrestrial, and infernal. And I guess the author did do a little podcast with Glitch Bottle. I don't know, I just found this on YouTube. I'm not going to really play that link, but you can check that out if you're interested in what this guy, it's about like a 2.5 hour interview he did with them. So I might go back and listen to it, but I just listened to the very, very beginning, and I wanted to really know what the book was about more than anything. And it turns out it's about summoning angels, demons, and other entities or spirits, which reminds me a lot of something else, the Key of Solomon, also known as the Greater Key of Solomon. It's a pseudepigraphical grimoire. It probably dates back to the 14th or 15th century Italian Renaissance and presents a typical example of Renaissance magic, apparently. It says many such grimoires attributed to King Solomon were written during the Renaissance. Wow, that's a lot. So, hey, King Solomon wrote this and this and this. This is where you really start seeing a lot of things coming out, not just occult, but historical, scientific, and other things attributed to the ancient past are coming out during this period of time in our history, ultimately being influenced by earlier works of Jewish Theosophical Kabbalah and Muslim magicians. These in turn incorporated aspects of the Greco-Roman magic of late antiquity. According to the mythical history of the document, I like that, mythical history of the document, at least they're being honest. As recorded in its introduction, Solomon wrote the book for his son Rehoboam and commanded him to hide the book in his sepulchre upon his death. After many years, the book was discovered by a group of Babylonian philosophers repairing Solomon's tomb. None could interpret the text until one of them, Iohe Grevis, suggested that they should ask the Lord for understanding. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and extracted a promise that he would keep the text hidden from the unworthy and the wicked, after which he was able to read it plainly. Iohe Grevis then placed a spell on the book that the unworthy, the unwise, or those who did not fear God would not attain the desired effect from any of the workings contained in the book. And this one here is one of the pentacles, the Great Pentacle. This is in the Bodleian Library, where supposedly the Leland manuscript came from, but they have no record of it being there. An equivalent figure also appears in a Latin version, Bodleian Library Aubrey manuscript, dated 1674. The figure is a variant of the Sigillum Ameth published by Athanasius Kircher. Kircher is another one, writing in the mid to late 1600s. So a lot of this stuff was going on in the 1500s, into the 1600s, and carrying on into the 1700s. A lot of it really gets its roots from the early to Middle Ages. Book 1 is about conjurations, invocations, and curses to summon and constrain spirits of the dead and demons in order to compel them to do the operator's will. It also describes how to find stolen items, become invisible, gain favor and love, and so on. So it's not just about finding golden plates in hills or mounds. Book 2 describes various purifications which the operator, termed exorcist, would undergo, how they should clothe themselves, how the magical implements used in their operations should be constructed, and what animal sacrifices should be made to the spirits. A Hebrew text survives in 2 versions. One's in the British Library on parchment manuscript. This is BL manuscript, was dated to the 16th century, but is now thought to be somewhat younger, dating to the 17th or 18th century. So, I mean, even with these, they can't really pinpoint exactly when they were written and who originally wrote them, other than accepting that it was Solomon. But, you know, I really don't think that anybody truly believes that Solomon actually wrote these. But this is just to link it again to the ancient world. There's several others. There's an important Italian manuscript in the Bodleian Library. There's an English edition based on the manuscripts of the British Library that was published by MacGregor Mathers in 1889, another occultist. In 1914, De Lawrence published The Greater Key of Solomon, directly based on Mathers' edition, to which he made alterations in an attempt to advertise his mail order business. Interesting. Of course, there's a French edition. The True Black Magic, or The Secret of Secrets, is kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It was translated from Hebrew by Iroa Grego, dated 1750. So Goethe mentions it in Faust. H.P. Lovecraft mentions the Key of Solomon in his supernatural horror and literature, saying that it illustrates the power of the weird over the Eastern mind. And Along with Johannes Kepler's Astronomia Nova, the Key of Solomon is one of two real-world texts that the fictional character Dr. Stephen Strange returns to the Kamar-Taj library in the Marvel Studios film Doctor Strange. So I guess they read off the books he's returning, and Key of Solomon is one of them. So it also reminded me of this guy, good old John Dee. We can't forget about him. With his 72 sigils to summon the angels. And I found a book, John Dee and the Empire of Angels, Magic and the Occult Roots of the Modern World by Jason Louv. And just a few little excerpts from this. The Western Mystery Tradition and Esoteric Protestantism. Western esotericism is often seen as a sideline curiosity or footnote to history, at best an early failed attempt at science. It also tends to be cast in an oppositional role to mainstream religious denominations and movements. I argue, following Dame Frances Yates, that this is not the case, and that the Western esoteric tradition has, for better or worse, been central to the development of European, English, and American spirituality, geopolitics, and empire. Definitely. Further, it is my contention that the angelic system of John Dee and Edward Kelly has been the central core of the Western esoteric tradition in its post-Renaissance form and has been the heart of Rosicrucianism, Scottish Rite Freemasonry, the Golden Dawn, and Thelema, and through Thelema of modern occultural movements like Satanism and witchcraft. These religious subcultures, in the final summation, do not exist in opposition to mainstream Protestantism, but are instead its esoteric component, in some cases affirming and upholding its theology by acting as its shadow. Therefore, Dee and Kelly's system has played an invisible but central role in the last 500 years of Western history. I'd have to agree with this author. I'd have to agree with that. And here, of course, we see Dee's sigils that he created and made to summon angels. This is his board, his holy table. And we looked at Joseph Smith's and his family's instruments and their board that they used. There's a lot of similarities. We looked at the Key of Solomon. It just looks like Dee made it a bit more complicated. While Luther had proposed a break with Rome, talking about Martin Luther, and Henry VIII actualized it in England, Dee created the plan for global Protestant victory over the church, a worldwide empire of angels, with Elizabeth I, not the Pope, as its spiritual and political head. Such a global Protestant hegemony would pave the way toward the second coming, and central to actualizing this plan with Dee's angelic system of magic. So I just wanted to point out as well that you see a lot of this, the second coming, or bringing about kind of the book of Revelation, and spurring on this coming of Christ or coming of the Messiah. The Jews have their own mythos and prophecy concerning this. And there are many who actively work to bring that about through different methods, whether it's Kabbalah, Tikkun Olam, whatever it may be. Different groups have different versions of this ideal manifest destiny. The Rosicrucians were certainly, along with John Dee, behind the colonization of America. And if you've paid attention to Michael Wan's work, you know how crucial John Dee is to all of the stuff that ties in with the Susquehanna mysteries. And Joseph Smith, right in there, right in that crowd, right on the Susquehanna, doing the same types of things. So I found another article on the Leland manuscript that really wanted to put the authorship on Francis Bacon. Of course, Francis Bacon is yet another metaphysician, magician character around the same time as John Dee, in the same place. All of these people writing and actively participating in whatever was going on during the time, whether it was the discovery of the New World or the colonization of it, or the seeking out of treasure, or the pushing of certain ideas within philosophy and the occult. So I took this from this article by Mather Walker, Francis Bacon and the 1753 Leland manuscript. And I'll just go through a few of the things he had to say about that, and then I'll finish it up with my thoughts. The idea has been bandied about that the first person to propose Francis Bacon as author of the Shakespeare plays was Delia Bacon in her 1857 book, The Philosophy of the Plays Unfolded. However, the old lady actually seems to have been more partial to Sir Walter Raleigh than Francis Bacon as author of the plays. And in any case, there are a number of earlier candidates for the honor. Some have thought the anonymous author of The Learned Pig came first in 1786, but the Reverend James Wilmot preceded the author of The Learned Pig in 1785, and the author of the Leland manuscript article, who preceded Wilmot in 1753, not only in his veiled fashion gave Bacon the authorship of the Shakespeare plays, but awarded him the palm for founding the Freemason and Rosicrucian fraternities as well. And John Marston preceded that author in 1598, and Joseph Hall in 1597. So Delia Bacon, even if she had proposed Bacon as the author of Shakespeare plays, would have been some 260 years late. Of these people, the most interesting is the author of the Leland manuscript article. This individual, whoever he was, knew more than he told, and told more than anyone else knew. The ancients fashioned their writings with a sense and an undersense, the former for the casual readers and the latter for the more discerning readers who were able to pierce the veil. Francis Bacon, who said he was going in the same road as the ancients, followed their precedent, and so did the author of the Leland manuscript article. Albert Mackey, who we read his bits of his article earlier, argued the Leland manuscript was based on a French original, which the fabricator had translated into archaic English. Well, he thought it was a fraud, but apparently he did believe that the information in it came from an original French document. Okay. So France seems to be where this is coming from. Again, as this touches on the things that I was reading about in The Widow's Son with Robert Flood, the alchemists, Rosicrucians being involved with Joseph Smith and his genealogy, and also with essentially the formation of Mormonism and what was going on at this time. They seem to be claiming their involvement in many of these things. So the proof, he said, were in the numerous preservations of French idioms. There was Peter Gower, derived from the French Pythagore for Pythagoras, masonry and masons for masonry and masons, the French C in the word being used instead of the English S. The phrase winning the faculty of Abrac, a pure Gallic idiom. Instead of acquiring the faculty, the word gainer being indifferently used in French as signifying to win or to acquire. And the word frères for brethren. What Mackey didn't realize is that these French idioms were designed to underscore the reference to France in the document. So they were on purpose wanting to point to France so that the learned or those in the know would understand. The Leland manuscript article indicates Francis Bacon was the first Mason. and thus the originator of Freemasonry. It puts Freemasonry in France immediately before it came to England. And in fact, there is evidence Freemasonry was in France while Bacon was there during the period 1576 through 1579. Moreover, this evidence connects that Freemasonry to Francis Bacon. In 1577, one of the many editions of Alciat's emblems was published. The Dies Meliora, or Emblem 45, in this edition is particularly interesting. Francis Bacon as founder of Freemasonry. Excuse me. Question 7 of the Leland manuscript asks, how does it happen that Masons are better teachers than other men? Answer 7 says Masons were better teachers than other men because the first of them received from God the art of finding new arts and of teaching them, whereas the discoveries of other men have been few and acquired only by chance. Seems to be a big theme. In his notes, Locke points out that Francis Bacon's claimed the discovery of the art of finding new arts and that this was the subject of his Novum Organum. And there was another link to Bacon in this statement. The Leland manuscript said God gave the art to the first Freemason, and Bacon implied that God had given the art to him. In his thoughts and conclusions, Bacon linked his art of finding new arts with the compass. He said in olden days, men merely skirted the shores of the old continents and had to await the discovery of a more reliable guide, the needle, i.e., the compass, before they crossed the ocean and opened up the regions of the New World. Likewise, he said, before men can voyage to remote and hidden regions of nature, they must first be provided with some better use and management of the human mind. This was his art of finding new arts, in connection with which, in his Valerius Terminus, Bacon said all knowledge is a plant of God, and ascribed to God the opening up of the world by navigation and commerce and the opening up of knowledge in the same age. However, it becomes clear that navigation and interaction between landmasses, even during ancient times, was going on. So I don't know if Bacon was just ignorant of this fact, or if he had his intent was to link only his ilk with the discovery of all great things and with the highest attainment of culture. But clearly, there have been cultures that have come before that reached high levels. Also, parts of the Leland manuscript, while putatively describing the Freemasons, actually describe the Rosicrucian fraternity. It seems that the anonymous author did this in order to show that they were connected. In her 1972 book, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, Frances Yates, following extensive researchers, said the European phenomenon of Freemasonry almost certainly was connected with the Rosicrucian movement. Bacon's last work, The New Atlantis, published posthumously, leaves no doubt that the island to which the travelers came is the land of the Rosicrucians. Before the travelers land on the island, they are handed a scroll of instructions by an official from New Atlantis. The scroll is signed with a stamp of cherubim's wings, not spread but hanging downward, and by them a cross exactly as the Rosicrucian Fama was sealed at the end with the motto, "Under the shadow of Jehovah's wings." A few days later, when another official of New Atlantis comes to visit the travelers in the stranger's house, he wears a white turban with a small red cross on the top. And when the travelers were conducted to the stranger's house, where the sick were cared for and offered payment for these services, their payment was refused. The Fama lays down the rule that brothers of the RC must heal the sick gratis. Moreover, the work also speaks of the wise men of the Society of Salomon's house that the travelers found on the island. Salomon is certainly intended to suggest Solomon, and Solomon's house was the Temple of Solomon, the model for all Masonic lodges. Thus, this is an allusion to the New Atlantis connecting the Rosicrucians with the Freemasons. And, here we really do have, at least as far as I can tell, the first imaginative work of a future based off of an imaginative work of the ancient past. So past Atlantis becomes the new Atlantis finally in America, apparently, at least for Francis Bacon. I don't know if we can look at America today and say that this is the new Atlantis, but there are those that may say that. And at some point, Atlantis fell. There are obvious Rosicrucian elements in the Leland manuscript. According to the note at the beginning of the article in the Gentleman's Magazine, the Leland manuscript was first published in Frankfurt, Germany. This was the city where some of the important publications connected with the Rosicrucian phenomena took place. Michael Mayer was one of the main writers who defended the Rosicrucians. His Silentium Post Clamors and Themis Aurea, two of the most important of these publications, were both published at Frankfurt in 1617 and 1618, respectively. A collection of opinions about various people regarding the Rosicrucians was published in Frankfurt in 1616. Robert Flood's Summum Bonum, or The True Magic Kabbalah and Alchemy of the True Fraternity of the Rose Cross, was published in Frankfurt in 1629. The imprint of Bacon's thought can be seen on every page of the two Rosicrucian manifestos. In his Valerius Terminus, Bacon says, "This is a thing which I cannot tell, whether I may so plainly speak as truly conceive, that as all knowledge appeareth to be a plant of God's own planting, so it may seem the spreading and flourishing, or at least the bearing and fructifying of this plant, by a providence of God, nay, not only by a general providence, but by a special prophecy, was appointed to this autumn of the world. For to my understanding it is not violent to the letter, and safe now after the event, so to interpret that place in the prophecy of Daniel, where spreading of the latter time, it is said, many shall pass to and fro, and science shall be increased, as if the opening of the world by navigation and commerce, and the further discovery of knowledge, should meet in one time or age." He repeats this idea with various variation in a number of his works. The Rosicrucian Manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis, opens with the following paragraph. "Seeing the only wise and merciful God in these latter days hath poured out so richly his mercy and goodness to mankind, whereby we do attain more and more to the perfect knowledge of his Son, Jesus Christ, and nature, that justly we may boast of the happy time, wherein this not only discovered unto us the half part of the world, which was heretofore unknown and hidden, but he hath also made manifest unto us many wonderful and never heretofore seen works and creatures of nature, and moreover hath raised men imbued with great wisdom, who might partly renew and reduce all arts in this our age spotted and imperfect to perfection, so that finally man might thereby understand his own nobleness and worth, and why he is called microcosmos, and how far his knowledge extendeth into nature." The Leland manuscript tells us the knowledge of the Masons is the knowledge of all nature. This appears nowhere in the constitutions of the Masons, but it certainly appears in the Rosicrucian manifestos. We are told that Masons have always, in every age, from time to time, communicated to mankind such of the secrets of nature as in general may be useful, and kept back such as would be harmful if they came into evil hands. This applies to the Rosicrucian manifestos, but not to Masonry. The Fama says of Christian Rosenkranz, although he could have bragged with his art, but specially of the transmutation of metals, Nowhere in Masonry is there any reference to the Masons creating a universal language, but there is in the Leland manuscript and in the Rosicrucian manifestos. The Confessio Fraternatis refers to the universal language made by the Rosicrucians, from the which characters or letters we have borrowed our magic writing and have found out and made a new language for ourselves, in the which withal is expressed and declared the nature of all things. Answer 8 of the Leland manuscript, What doth the Masons conceal? States that they conceal the universal language of Masons. Moreover, the note at the beginning of the article in the Gentleman's Magazine stating that the Leland manuscript was first published in Frankfurt, Germany, contains an interesting allusion. In 1667, Thomas Sprat's History of the Royal Society was published in Frankfurt. This was the book with the engraving showing Francis Bacon under the shadow of the wings of the angel that so obviously alludes to the phrase at the end of the Fama Fraternitatis, sub umbra adorum Vitorum Jehovah. So the idea that an ancient human society, vastly superior in intelligence, possessing almost godlike capabilities, and producing almost supernatural works and wonders, who then suddenly and violently disappear into the annals of time, and yet somehow transmitted their wisdom through time in some mysterious unbroken chain of oral history that was eventually written down and then copied repeatedly and religiously over the ages by monks, translated from language after language, until, at present, we can buy a paperback copy of Plato at the bookstore and think that Atlantis was probably real because this Plato guy is legit. This idea sounds like the perfect history, a history to inspire present and future generations to strive for higher ideals, standards, concepts of beauty, artistic expression, philosophy, science, religion, etc. Combined with works of their present period devoted to imagining an even more glorious future of humans surpassing the ancients and even the gods themselves, much like the new Atlantis. This idea of history, of our origins, is often passed off as a purely scholarly endeavor, one that requires a degree of higher learning, one for educated, authoritative scholars who bore us to death with their stats and dates and places. That historians can generally be trusted, and therefore we can know our history without caring or connecting to it in any meaningful way, seems to be the prevailing attitude of many. Ancient history isn't history, though. There's no real paper trail, if you will, to the ancient world. Most existing manuscripts of ancient history are from the Middle Ages. And of those still extant, it cannot truly be said that they aren't completely fabricated to suit a historical narrative that was more pleasing to those in power. Even actual scholarship into the ancient world, their writings and their culture, has really only been going since the 1800s, at least in full steam, not counting what was being done during the Middle Ages. After the discovery and translation of the Rosetta Stone, which could also just as easily be fraudulent, and the emergence of Egyptology. The further back we go into history, there always comes a point where it's no longer verifiable history anymore. This is where it becomes myth and legend, the stuff that truth is actually made of. This is why myth and legend should always inspire a people to greatness, whereas history can only inform, and as a consequence, disinform as well. If myth and legend are inspirational, then history should reflect the state of consciousness of its people. If history is written with an intent to deceive and hide truth, then the people will live out the mythos of that history. Every great mythos should both inspire and also stand as a cautionary tale to future generations. On some level, myth is more true than history. If history can hide truth, then myth can reveal it. If history repeats itself, it's because mythos contains truth, and truth is a pattern repeating through time and space, discernible and knowable. How can we truly know the ancient past? We imagine it. It's that simple. We imagine our future. We even imagine what's happening right now. So why not imagine the past? When facts are less important than truth? When we can no longer trust our history, shouldn't we be able to create a new mythology? One that serves us better, one that allows for a different historical narrative, overlapping the one we've been given, that brings deeper meaning to the ever unfolding mystery of existence? History will become a mystery when we look to it for truth, beauty, and inspiration. When we see it as a story instead of feeling distanced from history and bored by its seemingly endless, mind numbing facts, we can choose to embrace the mythos that underlies it, that breathes life into its empty shell. We could be active participants in creating that mythos for future generations to draw inspiration from.